أنا دكتور خالد وليد، ربان سفينة النجاة إلى شواطئ بكة القدس. I am Dr. Khaled Waleed, the captain of the ship of salvation to the shores of Baka, Jerusalem.
Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive with me today?
Always excited to dive in.
Awesome. Well, today we're tackling some pretty big concepts in Islamic philosophy.
Oh, like what?
We're going to be looking at irada and mashia, will and divine will.
Ah, yes. Those ideas can be a bit tricky to wrap your head around sometimes.
Yeah, they definitely get used interchangeably sometimes, which just leads to more confusion.
Exactly. But luckily, we've got a great guide to help us sort it all out. We're going to be exploring excerpts from Dr. Khaled Waleed's book, Resolve and Decision.
And he really delves into those tricky differences between irada and mashia, drawing on verses from the Quran to explain how they work together. That interplay between human will and God's will, that's what we're going to try to unpack today.
Sounds fascinating. I'm ready when you are.
Great. So let's start with the basics. What exactly are we talking about when we say irada and mashia?
Well, let's see. Think of it this way. When we talk about irada, we're talking about the thought behind something, the intention. That first spark in your mind when you want something or you're thinking about doing something.
So like when I'm daydreaming about taking a trip to Morocco.
Exactly. That's irada at play. It's all about those mental desires and plans.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. So then what about mashia? Where does that fit in?
Well, that's where things get real, so to speak. Mashia is about action, the actual steps you take to make that trip a reality. So in your Morocco example, mashia is you actually booking that flight, packing your bags, and getting on that plane.
So irada is the thought, the dream, and mashia is actually making it happen.
You got it. And, it's interesting. Dr. Waleed actually makes this really helpful analogy in the book. He says irada is like saying, I want something.
And mashia is saying, I will something.
Exactly. It's a subtle difference in language, but it really gets to the heart of what sets these two concepts apart.
I like that. It's super clear. So then, how does this apply to God's will? How do we understand divine will within this framework of irada and mashia?
Ah, that's where it gets really interesting. Because think about the phrase kun fayakun.
Be, and it is, right?
Exactly. And Dr. Waleed points to that phrase as a powerful illustration of how God's will works. Kun fayakun represents the moment of creation.
So first, God willed to create. That was the irada.
Right. And then when he said be, that was the mashia, the action, the bringing forth of creation.
Wow, I never thought about it like that before. And does that suggest that God's actions aren't random or arbitrary?
Yeah, exactly. There's a wisdom behind them, a plan.
So everything is pre-planned. That's kind of mind-blowing. But also makes me think about where do we fit into all this? What about our free will? If God already has a plan, does our will even matter?
That's a question that a lot of people wrestle with. And it's a big one. It's actually where Dr. Waleed's perspective gets really interesting. He argues that human will definitely does exist, but it exists within the framework of God's will.
Hold on, so you're saying our free will is somehow limited by God's will?
It's less about limitation and more about, how do I put it, almost like we're being steered before we're even given a choice.
Steered before given a choice. That's a powerful image. So can you give me an example of how that works in practice? How does Dr. Waleed explain that?
Well, he uses some examples from the Quran, like the story of Abraham being commanded by God to sacrifice his son Ishmael. You remember that story, right?
Yeah, of course.
In that story, both Abraham and Ishmael surrendered to the will of God. They were submitting to that divine plan. That's a classic example of this idea of ultimate submission.
Right, okay. But then how do we make sense of other stories where people seem to make different choices? What about Joseph and Potiphar's wife? He chose not to give in to temptation, right? How does that fit with this idea of a preset course? I'm a little lost. Does Dr. Waleed address that at all in the book?
He does, and that's a great question because the story of Joseph really gets at the heart of this whole free will thing. Yeah, Joseph definitely made a choice, right? He chose to resist. But Dr. Waleed says that doesn't mean we're operating outside of God's will.
So what, God gives us choices, but within certain boundaries?
Kinda, yeah. He suggests that God gives us this capacity to choose, even though ultimately, the big picture, that's still guided.
Okay, so it's not like we have no free will.
Not at all.
It's just that it exists within this divinely ordained context.
Precisely. Our choices are irada. They definitely matter. They shape who we become. But all of that is still playing out on this stage that's already set,
It's like knowing the destination, but getting to choose the route.
Exactly.
I love that. It kind of takes the pressure off, I don't have to obsess over every little decision.
Right. It's not about control. It's about trust.
Trust in the bigger picture.
Yeah, and I think that's a huge part of what Dr. Waleed's getting at, recognizing God's will. It can actually bring a lot of peace.
Peace in knowing that things are unfolding as they should.
Exactly. Even if we don't always understand why.
But that's still kind of hard to grasp, Like, how do I connect that to my everyday life?
Well, I think it starts with understanding that even our thoughts have this spiritual weight to them. Dr. Waleed actually describes irada as like an energy.
An energy.
Yeah. It's this energetic force that comes before Mashiach. He says that every action, every creation, it starts as a thought, an intention.
So you're saying my intentions really do matter?
They do. But the key is to make sure those intentions are in line with God's will. It's not just about what we want.
So how do I figure out what God wants from me?
Well, there's no easy answer to that, unfortunately. But Dr. Waleed really highlights the importance of prayer, reflection, studying the Quran.
So more about tuning into my inner wisdom than like waiting for a sign from above.
Yeah. It's about cultivating a deeper awareness of God's presence in your life and making choices that, resonate with that presence.
And I'm guessing that's a lifelong journey?
It is. It's an ongoing process of trying to align your will, your irada, with God's will, His Mashiach.
Makes sense. But what about those times when I totally miss the mark? When I make a choice that I realize later wasn't really the best one? What happens then?
We all make mistakes. That's part of being human. The important thing is that we learn from those mistakes.
So it's not about being perfect?
Not at all. It's about seeking that alignment and recognizing that even in those moments when we stumble, maybe there's a bigger plan at play.
This really makes me think about how I approach, everything, really.
In what way?
Well, it's less about trying to force things to happen and more about trusting that there's something bigger guiding it all.
And that trust, it can be really liberating, can't it?
Totally. It frees us from thinking we have to control everything. It reminds me of something else Dr. Waleed talks about, the way the Quran uses certain verbs.
Yeah. Which ones?
Coming and going.
Right. I'd forgot about that. How did he connect those to irada and Mashiach?
He says that coming often represents God's will in action.
So Mashiach.
Yeah, something that's been set in motion is reaching its destination. But going, that usually refers to us, to our own will.
So we're going, but within the context of God's coming.
Exactly. It's like those verbs are metaphors for how divine will and human will work together.
Wow, that's such a cool insight. I love how Dr. Waleed finds these hidden layers of meaning in the Quran.
Me too. It makes you want to go back and reread those verses. Maybe you'll catch something you didn't see before.
Totally. That's the beauty of deep diving into these topics.
It really is. But, we've been talking a lot about the theory behind all of this. I think it's time we shifted gears a bit.
You mean get into the practical stuff?
Exactly. Because, how do we actually apply these concepts to make our lives better?
Great question. I think that's where the rubber really meets the road.
It is. And that's exactly what we're going to explore right after we take a deep breath and really let all this sink in. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about irada, we've talked about Mashiach, we've seen how they work in God's actions and how they play out in our own lives. But I think the big question now is, how do we actually use all of this? How do we apply this understanding to make our lives, better?
I think it starts with a shift in perspective. It's about moving away from that constant focus on what we want and starting to see our desires through the lens of God's will.
So it's not about forcing things to go our way.
No, it's more about aligning ourselves, aligning our will with something bigger than ourselves.
Okay, I get that. But how do I actually do that? How do I know what God wants from me?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? There's no easy answer, unfortunately. But, Dr. Waleed does offer some guidance in the book.
Oh, what?
He talks about the importance of practices like prayer, reflection, and studying the Quran. It's about actively seeking guidance, listening to that inner voice, the one that connects us to the divine.
So it's not about waiting for some big, obvious sign?
Not necessarily. It's more about cultivating that awareness of God's presence in our lives and then, making choices that align with that presence.
And it's a process, right? It's not like we just figure it out overnight.
Exactly. It's a lifelong journey. There are going to be times when you feel super connected and times when you feel lost. But the key is to keep striving, keep seeking that alignment.
That makes me feel better, actually. I kind of like the idea that it's an ongoing thing. What about those times when, I make a choice that I later realize, wasn't the best choice? Have I messed everything up?
We all make mistakes. That's part of being human, right?
So it's not about being perfect.
Nope. It's about learning from those experiences and keeping moving forward. Trusting that even when we stumble, there might be a bigger plan at play.
This whole conversation is really shifting how I think about things. It's like, it's not about control anymore. It's about surrender, but not surrender in like a passive way.
Exactly. Dr. Waleed talks about this too. He says that surrender isn't about giving up.
It's about actively choosing to submit to a will that's, well, bigger than our own.
You got it. It's like he uses this metaphor of a sailor, you know.
Oh,
A
right.
skilled
yeah.
sailor understands that it's better to work with the wind and the current instead of fighting against them. They still have a role to play. You know, they're still making choices, but they're doing it within this larger context.
Love that metaphor. It really captures this balance between our effort and recognizing that there are forces at play that we can't always control.
Exactly. And recognizing that can be so freeing. We don't have to carry the weight of the world on our shoulders. You know, we can let go of that need to micromanage everything, to force things to go our way. We can surrender to the wisdom of a plan that maybe we don't fully understand, and trust that even in those moments when we make mistakes, there's a purpose.
This has been amazing. I feel like I have a whole new framework for everything, really. Not just my choices, but like for understanding reality itself.
That's what's so incredible about diving into these big concepts, isn't it?
It really is. It makes you think about your place in the grand scheme of things.
And the interconnectedness of it all. You know, the dance between what we will and what God wills.
Speaking of which, I think it's time for our final thought to leave with our listeners. We've talked about how our choices matter, even within God's plan. But, you know, if everything is ultimately part of his plan, does that mean we're not really responsible for our choices?
Wow, that's a tough one. A question that has puzzled people for ages.
And maybe there's no easy answer. But maybe that's okay, right?
I think so. Sometimes the questions are more important than the answers.
I think you're right. It's the grappling, the wrestling with these big ideas that helps us grow.
Totally. It's about embracing the mystery and letting it shape us. Trusting in that wisdom that, you know, goes beyond what we can grasp.
Well said. So to all our listeners out there, keep pondering, keep exploring, keep diving deep. Until next time.
Farewell.
أنا دكتور خالد وليد ربان سفينة النجاة إلى شواطئ بكة القدس. I am Dr. Khaled Waleed, the captain of the ship of salvation to the shores of Baka, Jerusalem.